10 a.m. Korea time. I'd like to welcome everybody to Heterodox Academy's annual forum on the Comfort Women issue, Comfort Women controversy. My name is Joseph Lee, a professor at Hanyang University. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so everybody sees my Google Doc, right? Okay. All right. So everyone sees this. So I'm going to start. Okay. So at the May 31st forum, I discussed the victim's rights perspective, which binarizes discourse between morally good and morally bad. The victim's rights discourse is dominant in South Korea. Can you guys do audio off? Okay. It's dominant in South Korea, and most media and academics do not report arguments or information associated with the Japanese far right, those who deny sexual slavery. For example, my students never hear about one, comfort stations for US soldiers in South Korea or in Vietnam. Number two, that the comfort women for US military included some women initially who served as comfort women for the Japanese military. Or number three, that in Yanbian today, most North Korean female migrants do sex-related work with the complicity of local government officials. These are, in a way, modern-day comfort women. But such things are never discussed, rarely discussed in the Korean media and classrooms. I have three outstanding questions and comments. One, did some or most comfort women for US military, did they also sign contracts? Has anyone researched this? How about women working at juicy bars today? Number two, in my review, Ramseyer and Morgan's critics argue that either A, there is no evidence for contracts, or two, that even if contracts existed, they were not signed under ideal free market conditions. I was wondering, does any mainstream scholar offer arguments or evidence that most Korean comfort women did not sign contracts? Or do we have a consensus that most women did sign contracts, but we can debate about the market conditions? In other words, do we have consensus on A, but not B? Okay, and then number three, some academics binarize voluntary contracts and sexual slavery. You can either have one or the other. But then other academics argue that a mix of each can happen depending on the time period. So likewise, in the complex view, the Japanese colonial regime, depending on the time period, both violated its colonial subjects' individual rights and promoted them. One can debate, therefore, which regime most violated or promoted individual rights, pre-colonial, colonial, or post-colonial. I wish my students to freely learn and discuss all relevant arguments and information so they can decide for themselves what is right. That is my wish for all participants. I thank everyone who participates in this forum and Google document in whatever mode of communication. Thank you. Okay, so that's my opening. And then, okay, so I think each of the panelists will have about 5 minutes or less. And then Mark, you're first. Go ahead. You have the floor. Oh, let me stop sharing now. Okay. Okay, Mark, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Mark Ramseyer, and I wrote this book with Jason, who is also on this session. Joseph asked me to explain my background a little. I'm a missionary kid. I grew up in Japan. I grew up in the southern island of Japan, Miyazaki, which is a extremely poor prefecture. It's the kind of place that sophisticated Tokyo professionals make jokes about it. But, you know, I'm proud of it. I went to public school through grade 6. And then switched to an American school system, and I like Japan. It's my home. It is where I grew up, and in many ways, it is my hometown. It's where I'm from, and I am what I am from having grown up there. Having grown up in Japan, I found the response of American academics in Japanese studies to the comfort women issue to be simply bizarre. It was a combination of having pretty obviously having failed to do any serious research on the topic, with a real sanctimoniousness, which I found hard to take as a combination. If you if you scour Japanese and Korean newspapers from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you will find virtually nothing about comfort women. Comfort women start showing up in the Japanese newspapers in the mid 80s, and they show up in the Korean newspapers in the 90s. And the reason is that a man named Yoshida Seiji published a memoir in 1983 in which he said that the army had sent him with a posse to Korea to round up several hundred women to work as comfort women, and which he did. He said the Asahi Shimbun newspaper in Japan took the story up, ran with it, and when the Korean translation of this memoir came out at the end of the decade, the prefecture simply went wild. In fact, Yoshida had made up his whole story. He admitted before he died that he had made it up. The Asahi newspaper retracted all its articles, but in the meantime, a South Korean organization with very close ties to North Korea had taken over the topic and had never let it go. That is the story on this. Now, before I stop, let me stress one point and then reply to 2 points on some of the Google Docs. The first is that we ask about a historical fact. We ask what happens. Joseph stressed a lot of very interesting questions about policy and morality and ethics and politics and so forth. We don't deal with that. In this book, Jason and I ask what happened, and that's it. Each of us has our own beliefs about the propriety of prostitution and whether it should be banned or regulated or allowed or whatever. That is not what this book is about. It's only about what happened. Several of you thought that we should look at women from other countries, that we should look at things like the Nanking Massacre. We focus only on women who came from Japan and Korea. About 40% of the comfort women seem to have come from Japan, about 20% from Korea. Korea was part of Japan, so in that sense, the Korean comfort women were Japanese citizens. We focus on that. We could write a bigger book, but we didn't. We tried to do this right, and this came to 400 pages. I think that's plenty long for a book, and so that's all that we did. Joseph asked whether, this was done under free market conditions, and several of you stressed that, look, the parties here, the comfort women, the brothel owners, were different ages, had different expertise, had different sets of information about what was going to happen. All of that is exactly true. And we are suggesting that that's why the contracts, which we go on at length. There's a lot of information about these contracts, but that's why the contracts take the shape that they do. If you look at these contracts, there are 3 principal points which I want to stress. One is that the women are paid a lot, and they're paid upfront in cash. The second is they work for a maximum term. No matter what happens, they can quit at the end of this term, which typically was 2 years. And then the third point was that if they generated enough revenue, they could quit early. But no matter what, they get to quit at the end of the 2 years. And our hypothesis about this, it was a hypothesis that I had outlined in my original article, is that, yeah, the comfort women weren't sophisticated, and they understood, some of them, enough of them understood that they weren't sophisticated, didn't understand this. They were going to go up to a place where they would be foreign, and who knows what. And so in order to recruit them, the brothel said, look, we will pay you this amount upfront in cash. So whatever happens, you know that you get at least this amount. It's there because this is a market involving people with different degrees of sophistication and so forth. It's the same thing with the maximum term. some of the women would have been worried, just like many people have stressed, that, brothels can cheat on the contracts. They can come up with additional debt. They can say, look, no, in fact, your revenue you raised, you didn't raise enough to pay it off, and so forth. And many of these women, perhaps a majority from Korea, not the ones from Japan, but the ones from Korea, were completely uneducated. They were not arithmetically educated. And so what do you do? You're worried that somebody's going to cheat you. You're going to be in the jungles of Burma, and they'll say, no, you can't go home. The contract says 2 years max, no matter what. And it's there precisely because the women were relatively less sophisticated, has less information, and so forth. And one last point about this, people stress that, look, this isn't like working in Tokyo. It's riskier, it's more dangerous, it's more foreign, and so forth. And that's exactly right. And that's our point. And that's why they're paid more. And that's why they serve a shorter maximum term. In Tokyo, the maximum term was typically 6 years. On the comfort women, most of them worked with a maximum number of years of 2. So thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you for your comments, those of you who wrote in the Google Docs. And thank you, the rest of you, for your comments, which I look forward to hearing. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ramseyer. And then the second panelist is Dr. Jason Morgan. Morgan, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yi. I wanted to thank you personally, Joseph, for your great patience and bravery in putting these talks together, and to thank Heterodox Academy for having this forum, and to thank everyone who offered critiques and even really sharp criticisms of our work. I really appreciate it. Professor O'Dwyer and I had a very good exchange. Please speak.
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the microphone. Okay. Is this any better?
Yes, thank you.
To shout at you. Okay. I wanted to thank everyone who offered critiques, especially Professor O'Dwyer. It was a really good exchange online if you want to check it out. Dr. Yi asked me to speak about the book, so I'll speak very briefly about that. I have 5 minutes. My classes are usually 140 minutes, so I'm going to sprint through this. The book has 2 halves. The first half is about the comfort women. We'll get to that. I'll get to that in a second. The other half of the book is about the way that academia works. And that's important because the way that academia works has determined how the comfort women issue has been discussed in academia. I'm not shouting at you, am I?
No, you're fine.
Okay, I'm talking really loud on this side. I don't want to hurt your ears. American academia, as I've experienced it, is an epistemologically closed space. And I think some good evidence of this is the way that people have characterized Mark Ramseyer and myself. When we started to write about this, people called us right wing. They called us denialists. We've been called Holocaust denialists, rape apologists, and so on and so forth. All of this is, of course, specious. We make no apologies for crimes, and we certainly don't deny the Holocaust. But I think this is important to bring up because these epithets, they're not arguments, and that's precisely the point. The point of academia is not to engage, at least in the United States, is not to engage with differing viewpoints. It's to get rid of them. So these sort of emotional outbursts are they're amulets to ward off critical thought. So when you hear things like right wing or denialist or rape apologist or so forth, these are people who are having an emotional reaction to a different idea. The whole idea is to keep the epistemological space closed and pure. I would refer you to the comments on the Google Doc by someone, and there were many anonymous. Anonymous is a popular name, apparently. There are many anonymous commenters. One of them seemed to have these people, they lose their names, they disappear into the ideology. I would say that Heterodox Academy exists precisely because of this kind of Stalinism in the American Academy. We take a different approach in the book. We're not denialists, we're positivists. If I could put a label on what we do, we build from evidence, and we try to make sense of what happened in the past. Once we clear away the clutter, including the racist dismissal of all scholarship not written in English, we focus on the women. And the key word here when focusing on the women, and not just the Korean women, but women in Japan or other women that worked at these comfort stations, the key word, for me at least, in our approach is agency. The contract logic that we use in the book, including the upfront terms and the indenture terms and the length of the contracts, all of this logic flows from our conviction, which I think is based on evidence, that the Korean women, we focus on the Korean women here, Korean women were active shapers of their own destinies. That's what I want to say in the book. This is, of course, as Professor Ramseyer just said, this is, of course, given the circumstances. There was a war. There was a comfort women system that was totally beyond the control of these women. Many of them came from abject poverty. Many of them were uneducated, perhaps even illiterate. All of these things we take up in the book. We don't assume a pure market logic. There is no pure market. It's a real world account. We don't try to impose a false heuristic on the past. We try to keep the heuristics light to make sense of what we find. I'm happy to take any questions that you have, any criticisms that you have. I would appreciate if the criticisms were made using a name. These sorts of anonymous comments are, well, I used a French term in the Google document. I'm sorry for that, but I would appreciate if people who attack us, which they're welcome to do, attack us using their own names. One last point about the premise of this talk, which is great. I mean, talking about the comfort women is fine, but even in the introduction to the talk, Professor Yi used words like right wing and so forth, and conservative. These terms are meaningless to me. For historians, these terms are meaningless. History is about the agency of people in the past and not about the biases of the people in the present. One last thing about the framing that the comfort women issue has been presented within so far as being a Japan-South Korea issue. I think that's actually not true. I think that the Japan-South Korea issue is a bit of a red herring. The people who run the comfort women system, and this is where the hoax comes in, the people who run the comfort women system in the ROK are North Korean spies. They work for North Korea. This is not a Japan ROK issue. This is a North Korean issue, and it's recently been taken over by a group called Code Pink in the United States, which is basically the American arm of the Chinese Communist Party. This is not a Japan ROK issue. The whole point was to defy Japan and South Korea. But I think if we emphasize the hoax, and I hope we do, we can see who's really behind all of this and try to get to the bottom of what's happening in the present. That's why our book is arranged the way it is. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Morgan. Dr. Sheng-mei Ma, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for arranging this. Let me see if I can share screen.
Yes, go ahead. Okay, I see it. Okay.
So, I mean, my response is very, very clear in the Google Doc. So I gave it a title, I gave it a name. I'm professor of English at Michigan State University. I'm from Taiwan. I'm in the English department, and a student of literature and film, somewhat different from the profession, the academic affiliation of other people. I am not involved in the Korea-Japan controversy in history and law and political science until now. I guess the important thing for me to say at the outset is I really feel that there's a lacunae of comfort women, a representational black hole, sort of a personal and historical trauma that belongs to the pain of others. Very, very hard to touch. It's almost like we are all blind man touching the elephant, frankly, sort of touching the open wounds of a lot of comfort women and then trying to describe what it is. So that's basically what I'm trying to describe. I mean, to interject a human dimension into this business contracts or alleged agency. This is really sort of a lacunae, sort of a black hole of comfort women particularly those outside of Korea and Japan, from Taiwan, China, and elsewhere. My personal involvement is really like 20 years ago, I translated this book. It was originally in Chinese, and I was urged to translate it into English, so I did. Silent Scars, History of Sexual Slavery by the Japanese military, a pictorial book. So there's a lot of photographs and captions and descriptions. So I basically translated that. That sort of began my involvement in this. And to talk about Taiwan's situation, it is closely tied to harder Japan idolizing in Taiwan, sort of attracting Japan's right-wing influence, even though Jason hates the term, but that's the term that I use. It's just very, very interesting that when Jason is saying that we are calling names by calling him denialists, he immediately turn around and call us Stalinists. So this one, for instance, is a good example of right-wing from Japan, Kobayashi's graphic book on Taiwan, Taiwan Lut on Taiwan. Here's a page from, and if I can just translate these speech balloons, this is the Taiwanese capitalist, very wealthy, very rich businessman, Xu Wenlong. He said, I found several comfort women, and I asked them if they were truly coerced, compelled, and they say no. In fact, it is impossible to compel them. In the Japan mainland, for instance, in the northeast, the poor farming villages, there were a lot of young girls who were sold by their parents to be military prostitutes. And this phrase is very, very interesting. In Japan's mainland, for instance, in the northeast, I was wondering whether northeast is referring to Hokkaido or perhaps the China's northeast, which is, of course, Manchuria, occupied by Japan at the time. In other words, in Xu Wenlong's perspective, the northeast, Manchuria, China's northeast, is actually part of Japan mainland. And this, of course, is a prominent pro-Japan leader in Taiwan, the ex-president of Taiwan, Li Denghui, as you can see, in samurai costume, deliberately provocative. And some commercial sort of opportunism involved as well. Chinese actress Zhao Wei wrapped in a Japanese flag. Or this Korean actress, Lee Sung-yoon, posed as a comfort woman. This is the novel that I quoted, Nora Okja-Keller's Comfort Woman. And her next book, Fox Girl, is actually about teen prostitution around US bases in Okinawa and elsewhere. This, of course, ties in what Joseph E. was talking about in terms of US bases in Japan. But I wonder, out of the Google Doc, there were so many words, only one visual aid, only one photograph. Out of so many words, there is only one photograph. Why didn't we choose a photograph about Korean comfort women? Why didn't we choose other things? Instead, we choose a U.S. Military personnel taking two Asian women, obviously, to do their business. So it's very intriguing, that particular choice. So this is also another book by Sheng-mei Lee, Korean-American author, native speaker. His first book was Native Speaker, but this one, A Gesture of Life, is on comfort women. But frankly, like I said, we're all sort of blind man, sightless man, touching the elephant of history and trying to describe what it is. So do these writers like Keller that I quoted earlier, or Sheng-mei Li. For instance, this one, if I can move this video panel a little bit. The girl was naked, and the skin of her young body looked smooth and perfect, except that her head was crooked too far upward. It was obvious her neck was cleanly broken. She was quite dead. She barely had any pubic hair. In other words, even writers, novelists, Korean American novelist Sheng-mei Li, trying to approach this subject, he is deliberately accentuating death, comfort women, prostitution with aesthetics. So it's a very, very problematic approach. There's a lot of quote here. I can simply just skip that. And I move on to the rape of Nanking. Of course, Mark just described that sort of the rape of Nanking falls outside of their parameters, but to me, it's sort of a natural corollary to move from one to the next, because perhaps the same Japanese soldiers went to the comfort stations and went to Nanjing in 1937 to 38. So this is Nanjing Requiem by Ha Jing. Or this book, Yan Geling's The Flowers of War, 金陵十三钗, and then turned into a film starring Christian Bale. Or the Chinese film City of Life and Death. And this one, Nanjing, 1937, a love story. And this is also the book that I refer to, Iris Chan's The Rape of Nanking. I think I'll skip the last slide, which is taken from The Rape of Nanking, showing the poor woman tied to hair, and then her private parts exhibited. I think I'll just stop share and stop right here.
Our next speaker is Dr. Chizuko Allen. You have the floor.
Hi, Professor Yi. Thank you so much for inviting me to this forum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I became involved in the comfort women issue in late 2014. So it's been almost 10 years now. But today, I would like to discuss a little bit about the importance of historical context. Because when I first handed in my PhD dissertation draft to my advisor many years ago, my advisor was a Korean historian. He was not happy because I didn't include much of the historical context. I only discussed my subject matter. So then I realized that the historical context is very, very important. So so in that line of thought, I would like to point out for the issue of Japanese military comfort women, I think there are two kinds of historical context that we should consider. So the first one is the context for the comfort station system itself, and the second one is the context of the international relations in the 1990s and beyond. Okay. So the first one, so we all know that there's a long history of wartime and peacetime sexual violence on women around the world, and there's no exception. So peacetime or wartime, there was always violence against the women, and there's no exception even for the Allies. So recently, I know that there was a 80-year anniversary for the Normandy landing that was celebrated not long ago. But I heard that, there was a lot of rape incidents that followed the landing itself. And anyway, so, thinking about Korea was, of course, no exception too. So I helped translate Professor Lee Young-hoon's book, The Anti-Japan Tribalism, okay, which, by the way, was recently published in English, okay, on Amazon. So you can buy a copy, a Kindle copy or a paperback copy. But anyway, so I like the book because it details the history of systematic abuse of women in traditional Korea as well as in modern Korea. So there was abuse of lower class women in pre-modern Korea, and also during and after the Korean War, South Korean military and government set up comfort women stations, their own comfort women stations for the Korean soldiers and American soldiers. Okay? And that wasn't all. Okay, we know that during the Vietnam War, there were a lot of rapes, right, by Korean soldiers who were deployed to Vietnam. But not only that, about 10 years ago in Japan, there was a journal article by a Japanese journalist that revealed that there were South Korean comfort stations set up by the South Korean military for their soldiers in South Vietnam. Okay, so the Japanese comfort station system was not unique, despite many beliefs. Okay, so I like to emphasize. Okay, yeah, and I really appreciate Professor Lee's reference to the Korean comfort women who worked for the American servicemen in South Korea, and other women also. Okay? So he's already talking about the context. So that the details of facts are very important, but at the same time, we should look at a much larger picture of abuse of women and evaluate the Imperial Japanese comfort station system in that context, I feel. Okay. And the second context I would like to think about is the international relations around 1990s, when the comfort women narrative was formed and the movement was developed. So I like the Jason and Mark's new book, that the comfort women hoax, because it refers to North Korea. Okay? It sheds light on the role of North Korea. Okay? Which is often disregarded in the United States. So the book says that actually it was South Korean Christian women leaders who reached out to North Korea beginning in the late 1980s. Okay? And North Korea, of course, happily responded and assisted South Korean women activists, right? Like Yoon Mi-hyun, who led the Korean Council for the comfort women movement. Okay, so South Korea helped develop the comfort women narrative and movement in many ways, I believe. So, yeah, so the narrative and the movement vilify Japan and pit Japan against South Korea. So this obviously benefited South Korea benefited North Korea, because North Korea had its own problems, like developing nuclear programs and having massive human rights violations. Okay, so people basically do things to benefit themselves. So no exception for North Korea. Okay? So my question to probably Mark and Jason, the authors of the book, is that, okay, so what benefit did the American academics receive from upholding the lies or the dominant narrative of comfort women and canceling you two people, and others, well, including me, who opposed that dominant narrative. So you mentioned that their narratives are like a religion or a crusade or a cult. So their beliefs include hostility against the world of capitalism and imperialism and against man's abuse of women. So, okay, so is their belief or is their fight just basically ideological? Is this an ideological fight? And is their ideology particularly hostile to Japan? And if so, why? Why Japan? Why not China, or why not North Korea? Or do these professors reap some benefit, some practical benefit from upholding their crusade? Okay, so that's my question to you, I guess. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. And then next we have Dr. Shaun O'Dyer. So Shaun, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to make, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I wanted to make 3 points. First is methodological, second related to historical issues, third to the sort of global context of multiple military comfort women's systems in the 20th century. So first, a methodological point. I get Mark's point that there is a logic to the credible, so just focusing on the credible commitments thesis, I get Mark's point that there's a logic to this that needs to be understood. I also understand his and Mark's point that they are regarding this as something that approximates how things really happened. I disagree with this. I just don't think that they can set up this idealizing model, and I do see this as a very idealizing model, and then shape it so that it accounts for systemic deviations from the compliance expectation, rational expectation, and legal enforcement conditions, which would make it work in ideal conditions. In effect, I see this almost as a self-sealing move, which insulates their thesis from falsification, and more or less in a rough Popperian sense. So I rather see this as an ideal type, which can be used as a heuristic to highlight, to disentangle the legal, quasi-legal, or outright criminal aspects of, for example, military comfort women systems in the plural, not just the Japanese one. Secondly, historically, Jason made the point in the Google Docs comments that the classical liberal or feminist critics of indentured prostitution, or what's called debt bondage prostitution, weren't around to comment or criticize it at the time. But I know he and Mark have read the Dongil Ibon, or what was then known at the time as a Towa Nippo articles, which were published in early 1939, a series of crusading articles in a Korean newspaper in Seoul, highlighting the systemic criminality of the prostitution recruitment, highlighting that that parents were being deceived systematically into giving their daughters over to recruiters, who were then dispatching them into prostitution. And some of them were also being sent to comfort women's stations. So that one incident mentioned women were being sent to a comfort women's station in Shandong in China. This is in 1939. And the journalists were asking questions about why the police were having difficulties and were not enforcing the law properly to catch up with these chicks, and rather pointedly said in one passage in one of these articles that the police seemed more interested in issues of Iwayuru Shiso Mondai, the sort of dealing with ideological problems, than they were with rounding up the pimps and spivs and rogue husband-wife couples who are involved in this trade. So there were strong criticisms from a more or less liberal point of view from rather brave journalists in Korean newspapers at that time, highlighting the systemic criminality of the system. The third point I wanted to make was about the sort of, I guess, some common features in military prostitution systems in the 20th century. One comparison we can highlight is with the French military prostitution system, which also involved trafficking colonial women, Moroccan and Algerian women, into military prostitution in various overseas territories, and even into metropolitan France after 1948, when prostitution had been declared illegal in France itself. And I think we have to, there are some common features. I mean, well, of course, there's brutality, there's a systematic law breaking or exploitation of legal loopholes to keep the system going. The fact that the patrons of this more or less clientelist system needed to a large extent, criminality to keep, or criminal action and behavior to keep the system going for them. And how we can look at how they exploited loopholes in international treaties. As I understand it, Japan and France were both signatories to the 1921 International, I think it's the League of Nations Convention against trafficking of women and girls. Both made exceptions for their overseas territories. They both exempted their overseas imperial territories from these from this convention, and we can see how they exploited this in recruitment of women particularly from Korea, where law enforcement was much, much weaker than even the weak law enforcement in Japan. And I wanted to make a final point, since I think I have time. So Jason complains about the sort of politicized nature, the name calling that's involved, right-wing, denialists, and so on. I noticed, however, that there was a certain thread of red baiting going through the book. One individual who I will not name, and this is a person I don't particularly get on with, who was singled out for her sympathies with the Japanese Communist Party, and a remark was made about how strong sympathy with the Communist Party correlates with criminal proclivities. I've already outed myself as a fellow traveler with the Japanese Communist Party in the previous webinar. And I just want to say again, well, you know, I'm quite friendly with the Japanese Communist Party. In fact, probably even more friendly than that person who was identified in the book was. I don't think I can say that I've had any criminal proclivities myself, although I did get busted for running a red light while I was riding my bike, running a stop sign while I was riding my bicycle about 2 years ago. That's probably the extent of my criminal behavior in Japan, however. Okay, that's all from my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Shaun. And then our final panelist is Francis on. Francis?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Francis. I'm calling in from Australia. I am somewhat similar to Professor Sheng-mei Ma. This is not my specialty, but my specialty is actually in psychology. So that's sort of the lens that I'm coming through with this. I did write a review of this book, which I found quite interesting, and I've posted the link to that in the public comments, but I'm just going to reiterate some of the points that I made in that review, and also ask a couple of questions in light of the discussion that's just been happening. So the first thing I noticed when reading about, catching up on what's been going on in the comfort women controversy is that just from a cognitive psychology standpoint, how complex it is to litigate historical issues because of how the fallibility and the suggestibility of human memory. And this has been well studied in a legal context. So something that was pointed out in the book was the Korean Council's attempts to manipulate the comfort women testimonies, which is definitely presents a challenge in terms of trying to reach the truth again, because now the only people who can actually remember what happened, then we don't have many assurances that their memories will be fully intact, especially given that it was a traumatic situation. So it definitely complicates issues. The next thing I want to bring up is, I guess, a question that the comfort women issue, and about the comfort women issue and what sort of reflection it has on history wars that are going on. So I would wonder, and open this up to everyone, what the comfort women wars teach us about, for example, history wars about slavery in America, and whether, for example, why people have, or should I say academics in the West have chosen to omit, for example, the role of Africans who sold fellow Africans into slavery. Let's see. And the last question I actually want to ask Professor Jason Morgan regarding some comments that you made at the beginning. So I agree with, as I mentioned in my review, I agree with your focus to describe rather than judge the comfort women situation, and focus on their autonomy rather than victimization under difficult circumstances. And I think I did find the title, The Comfort Women Hoax, a little bit provocative. And I wonder if by trying to emphasize the North Korean connection while reframing the comfort women situation, trying to make the North Korean connection could potentially have been an overstretch that could, I guess, put off people who might otherwise be sympathetic to your interpretation of the controversy. I think those are the main points that I wanted to bring up. But thank you, Joseph, for having me in the discussion panel.
Okay, thank you, Francis. Okay, let me know when we can start calling you Dr. Francis. Okay, all right. Now I'd like to open up to the floor. So we encourage everyone to ask questions or comment, whatever your level of, whatever your level of scholarship. Does anyone have a question or comment? Okay, if not, then I can start with one of my students. So one of my students posted a question. I posted it on her behalf. It's on Zoom chat. And then she said, so the basic question is, why did, if most Korean comfort women, if they signed contracts, then why did Japanese government pay reparations? Right. So that's basically it, right? Right. So that was a student question number one. Okay. Now, can we have maybe a couple more questions or comments? Ivana, did you have any question or comment that you want to share, or you want to pass at this time?
Yeah, I'm still thinking of my question.
That's fine. And then anybody else from the audience? Paul, Meredith, I see your faces. I encourage everybody else to turn your video on. Okay. Paul, do you have a question or comment?
It's something I've always wondered, actually. You got the situation where the Korean Council has essentially authorized a number of women to speak. And I've always wondered exactly how many women that is.
Okay.
Has anybody ever listed who actually is, who their designated speakers are and how many?
Okay, so we have at least two questions from the floor. Oh, and before we hit those questions, I wanted to address the point from Professor Ma about, why did the Google Doc have one picture, the picture of the comfort woman for the U.S. military? I think I did that because that picture had the most impact on my students. So my students in Korea, they never seen a picture of a comfort woman for U.S. military. So they see many stories and pictures of comfort women for the Japanese military. But for the U.S. military, that picture was their first time. Okay. All right. Now let's go ahead and address Paul's questions and my student's question. Or anyone like to address them? So the student's question was, why did the Japanese government pay reparations?
Can I take a stab at this?
Okay, sure. Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah.
Morgan.
It's a great question. I think the answer is simple. It's political. It has nothing to do with historical fact. This is a foreign relations problem. You pay some money and make the problem go away. It's very simple, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
so if I can say something, yeah, so the Japanese government never paid reparations to the comfort women. Yeah? So in 1995 or so, that the government helped establish the Asian Women Fund. That was a semi-government organization, and started distributing what you call not reparation, not even compensation, what you call some kind of money anyway, to the victims or former comfort women in Korea, Taiwan, and elsewhere, right? So they distributed to over 100, 200 women. And some, of course, in South Korea, the Korean Council opposed and blocked Korean women from receiving the Japanese money. So therefore, but still, I think 61 or 62 South Korean women received the money from the Japanese organization. But anyway, that's not called reparation. That was repentance money or something like that. So Japan at that time accepted a moral responsibility, but not legal responsibility.
Okay, do we have any other questions from my students or from the audience? Are you ready? Okay, I think my student is still getting ready. Well, let me open up to everybody, including the panelists. So, Professor Ma, did you have anything you wanted to add? Shang?
So I really want to emphasize the human aspect of this. In our conversations thus far, very, very few people talked about female bodies, human feelings. Everything's reduced to international relations, reduced to politics, even though Jason mentioned the key word of agency. But where exactly is agency? At a comfort station, when a woman is repeatedly receiving guests, repeatedly raped, where exactly is the agency in that? Business transactions, money up front, all these terms have been sort of thrown about. I was really curious how many of us have actually talked to comfort women, really talked to them, and see how hesitant they are, how repressed they are, understandably. And of course, try not to use that as the justification for the fact that they were lying. A lot of us are lying for our careers, for our profession, for our academic accomplishment. They are also lying because they have to. I mean, that's the Francis term, Francis angle comes in, psychology, the return of the repressed, fragmented personality, fractured experiences, all these things. Well, fractured experiences because their bodies have been fractured, their mind has been fractured. Is this too sentimental on my part? Are some people sort of recoiling from this kind of human touch? But we are talking about humans after all, rather than sort of universal raping of women. I mean, I'm really curious and posed a question to Chizuko, I guess. When we are talking about Japanese comfort station, Japanese rapes, you immediately jump to other instances of rapes. All are heinous, all are atrocious, I agree with you. But the strategy is such that we can immediately universalize. They rape, therefore it's okay for me to rape. I mean, that just doesn't really hold water to me.
Yeah, if I can respond very quickly. Yeah, of course not. Yeah. I mean, for example, we talk so much about Korean comfort women. However, we seldom talk about Japanese comfort women. And there were many. And there were testimonies published by Japanese women about that early on in the 60s and 70s. But we don't even deal with those. We don't even talk about, and they were never translated into other languages. And therefore, the people in the world don't even know that there were Japanese women who suffered, who lived through that experience. So I really feel that, you know, in that sense, we shouldn't just dwell on just one nationality or one location. Okay? And also, yeah, just if I may point out, you know, your question about the northeast of Japan. Yeah, that's not about Manchuria. That's about the northeastern part of the Japanese main island, Honshu. And so that area was pretty poor. So if you know that the Japanese TV drama, Oshin, that was very, very popular in the 1980s. Yeah, the Japanese people in the area suffer so much from, the poor harvest and everything. And so they had to sell their daughters oftentimes. Yeah, so many of them served as prostitutes in cities, and maybe some of them served as comfort women later on, in the 30s and the 40s. So
Thank you for your explanation. Very, very quickly, I just want to say that for a Chinese reader, reading that Kobayashi's comic book, graphic novel, their response would immediately be linking those two words, Dongbei, northeast, with Manchuria. And I don't know whether that's sort of deliberate on the part of translators.
This is a Japanese place name, in fact. If you remember the great northern Japanese earthquake that took place about 12 years ago in Japan, the great earthquake in Japan, that took place in that exact same region in Japan.
I take your point, but my point is really that most Chinese readers reading that Chinese translation of Kobayashi's on Taiwan, they would have very, very little idea that it refers to that region of Japan. They would immediately associate that with Manchuria.
Yeah,
That's
maybe
the
they
point.
need a footnote in the book. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I see a hand from Shaun and then Mark. Shaun, go ahead first.
Actually, Mark was there before me, so he can
okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, then Mark, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Shaun. Let's see. Professor Ma, you asked, are you being too sentimental? The answer is absolutely. Okay, look, one question is, and you seem to be taking what the Comfort Women says, what the most prominent, the most visible of the Comfort Women saying as fact. The point here is that if nothing is said about something for 4 decades, and then somebody starts making accusations in the context of asking for money, demanding money, that's usually not a very credible way of getting testimony out. Now, in this case, it's the fact that they're elderly ladies makes it seem sympathetic, but I'm sorry, this is not the way in which you find out what actually happened. Now, you keep talking about rape. This is sex for money. If you want to call sex for money rape, then you can, but that's not the way in which we usually use the term. And I think there's reason to use different terms for the case where a woman decides, look, I will have sex with you if you pay me the amount that I want to be paid. In terms of whether these are believable, this raises the question of how many women were authorized by the Korean Council to speak. I'm not sure. It wasn't very many. For many years, Lee Yeon-soo was the one who was most visible. She broke with Yoon Mi-hwan and the Korean Council and started accusing them of financial fraud and so forth. And one question is, why did she break with them? The most plausible reason that I have heard, plausible to my mind, is because the Korean Council, Yoon Mi-hwan, dropped her. Why did they drop her? They dropped her because she was no longer believable, because the Media Watch, the Korean small media company that's been spending a lot of time working on this, cataloged all of Lee Yeon-soon's testimony. And it turns out she has had 20 different stories about her past. She was either in one case, she simply went off because the person who recruited her offered her a very nice dress and new pair of shoes, and her friend was with her. And this is the one that's actually the most convincing of these stories. But after that, she was recruited in 1942, 43, and 44. And you say, well, it's hard to remember the date all this time when you're not educated. She served for 3 years, for 2 years, for 10 months. There's simply no logic, no coherence to her story. She's pretty clearly simply telling the audience whatever comes to her mind at when it comes to it. And that's why the Korean Council dropped her. And that's why the Korean Council then picked somebody else. Chizuko, you asked why do the people who are doing all of this among American academics, why are they doing what they do? We speculate in the book, but if Jason wants to answer that, he's welcome to. I don't. I don't really want to accuse people more than I already have. It's like, okay, Shaun, I think at the root, I think you and I would probably agree that some of these women were sold by their parents and they didn't want to go and their parents pressured them to go. I think you and I would also agree that some of these women went because they thought it was their best job that was available to them. At that point, I think where you and I differ is the relative fractions involved. And I think you would give a larger fraction to kids forced by their parents into this than I would. This goes to what explanation you have for why the contracts have the structure that they do. I think your explanation would be that these kids are being sold by their parents, and the parents want to cash at the outset, and that's why they're being offered. But I think that's would be what I would want to say there. In terms of whether this has anything to do with the Nanjing massacre, Professor Ma. The Soviet army, as it was retreating over Manchuria, over Germany, it raped lots and lots of women. I don't think one should move from there to saying that Russians necessarily are violent towards other Russian women. Most armies, treat their fellow countrywomen differently than women that they locate in enemy territories. I think that's one reason why the way one should try to make sense of the comfort women system for the 60% of the comfort women who are from either Japan or Korea would not necessarily translate into how women from enemy territories like China necessarily would have been treated.
I'm sorry to interject. I just wanted to suggest that we take Ivana's question to get some more questions from the floor before we continue, if it's all right.
Shaun, you're next. Do you want to concede to Ivana, or did you have a quick comment?
Yeah,
Shaun?
I'd prefer to have a question from the floor go before I.
Okay, sure. Okay, go ahead, Ivana.
Okay. First, I wanted to thank Professor Gee for letting me be a part of this forum. I did request to be inside of it, so thank you. So I wanted to bring up, I understand that a lot of us are bringing up the idea of morals and women's bodies. However, I don't think that that's exactly what the book is about. I do think that the issue can go beyond what is touched on in the book, and it can either be a whole other book or even more chapters. Also, I agree with, I forgot who said it, but I think that this idea of the comfort woman is not solely a Korea-Japanese phenomenon. I think how the comfort woman issue came about in Korea, I think it's highly politicized in nature and how it came about. So while this is a moral and human issue, I think that it's been politicized and it's been used as a political tool. So that is something that we have to focus on. And I guess for my question, I wonder about what the end goal of those who continuously demand response and action from Japan is. I read a bit about how Japan has taken moral responsibility and has paid reparations, I guess. So I wonder what else others are wanting. This is a genuine question. And for reference, I'm thinking about it from my perspective with slavery in the US and how African Americans can only demand an apology and ask for reparations for so long. And I personally found the admission of fault to be enough. And I was wondering, has Japan not already admitted fault? And if not, what else is wanted?
Okay, does anyone want to tackle Ivana's question? Okay.
I've got a lot of responses, but Shaun was first, so please go ahead, Shaun. Unless anybody else wants.
Yeah, sure. Oh, I'm just trying.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just having trouble clicking on the audio icon. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with Chizuko and with Sheng-mei about the Northeast, and I'm emphasizing here the Tohoku region. In her book on the comfort women system and international prostitution in Korea and Japan, by Caroline Norma, she mentions in the late 1920s during the Depression that Tohoku, there were a lot of rural families in Tohoku that fell into absolute destitution, and they were systematically selling off their daughters into prostitution. And by the way, I want to say that I've met Caroline Norma. She is not a right winger. She's a firm, stalwart member of the Australian radical feminist tradition, is very bolshy on issues such as the abolition of prostitution or even gender critical feminism. So she highlights that these women were being sold off en masse, well, I can't say, I mean, in the thousands, to brothels in Tokyo, and that what was going on was not really conforming to the credible commitments model of indentured prostitution. There's a lot of exploitation. There's a lot of deception. There was a lot of non-consenting girls being consigned into this trade, underage or not. And there was a lot of horrible and deceptive and illegal manipulation of their working conditions. And this, as far as I'm concerned, pretty much set the stage for what was going to happen much later when that system was taken up by the military and expanded massively during the wartime years. So I just want to say to Professor Ma, yes, we are concerned about women's bodies. There are people who want to discuss that in this webinar, and to say how they were subjected to abuses, which is very hard for us to imagine as upper middle class citizens in advanced democracies in the early 21st century.
Thank you, Shaun. I have a question from one of my students, and then we'll go to Jason Morgan. Can you introduce yourself, your name?
Hi, my name is Haesung Lee. My major is data science. It is okay. As I know, if I understand your argument correctly, it seems that the comfort woman engaged in prostitution for military through trustworthy method and reasonable process, given that Japanese coal miner and farmer during the 1930s and 1940s faced forced mobilization and labor condition different from their contracts. Is it an overreach to assume that the recruitment and mobilization of comfort women were not conducted legitimately?
Right. So my student Haesung is linking the issue of, say, like forced labor, like for coal miners, with comfort women. And so the question is, well, one, do you think that coal miners and other workers, were they recruited legitimately using market logic, or were they basically coerced, state coercion? And that's question number one. And number two is, depending on your answer, is there a link to the comfort women system? Okay. Jason, you are next. So do you want to address this and other questions that were raised?
Excuse me. Thank you very much. There's a lot of questions on the table. I'm going to try to run through them as quickly as I can. First, I wanted to address Ivana's point about the moral responsibility. I think it's an important one, and I take it very seriously. Chizuko-san raised the point about the difference between the moral responsibility and the state responsibility. I think Japan took the moral position because it was prevented by the 1965 treaty between Japan and South Korea from going into the legal issue of reparations and responsibility for what happened during the war and during the period of annexation. So this is a political position, you could say. It's a position of convenience, but I think it's also a position that honors international law And you can extrapolate backwards from that into honoring law and wartime if you like. But I think it's important to make that distinction. I would make another distinction as well between American slavery and the comfort women. American slavery was an infamous crime, and there's still been no reckoning for it whatsoever. I tend to be very radical in this position. I think everything that was built using slavery and everything that was gained by someone else using slaves should be given up and I don't know, returned to whom, but I take a very radical position on this. Slaves have no rights. They have no legal standing. They don't enter into contracts whatsoever. They're considered chattel. They're considered the same as animals. The comfort women were not seen in this way whatsoever. I think that's a very important distinction to make there. I'd like to return to Professor Ma's point about, first of all, about politics. I think the reason that I mentioned Stalinism was because I wanted to prove the point that people in the American Academy tend to look at the comfort women issue from a very extreme or simply political lens. And I think, Professor Ma, you've proven my point beautifully. About the human dimension, I would refer you to Park Kyu-ha. She's tried to speak to these comfort women, and I agree completely that there's tremendous trauma involved in this. I agree completely about the human dimension, Professor Ma. I sincerely am on board with what you're saying. People would like to speak to the comfort women directly. They can't because they're under the control of North Korean agents in South Korea. Ono-san made a point that my glib response about the question of reparations was too simplistic. Well, in a sense, it was. I mean, it took 5 seconds to make, but I wasn't trying to be flippant. I was trying to say that it was political. And I don't say this from my own point of view. I say this because Yoon Mi-hyung, who is basically in control of this issue, or was until recently in South Korea, she is working for the North Koreans. Her husband works for the North Koreans. Her relatives are convicted North Korean spies. She has been, excuse me, I'm getting a phone call. I don't know if you can hear that. Yoon Mi-hyung was working behind the scenes with the previous administration in South Korea to politicize this issue. I mean, it's clearly a political issue. And inside of Japan as well, the Japanese government was talking about paying reparations just to make the issue go away. This goes back to the Kono years. Hata Ikuhiko sensei's book on this is very good, if you'd like to check it out. My response to Ono-san. About Kobayashi, Professor Ma, please read some better scholars inside of Japan than Kobayashi. Kobayashi is a provocateur. He's not a scholar on this. I think people tend to make a caricature of this issue. I mean, Kobayashi does in no way represents scholarship inside of Japan on the comfort women issue. He's a manga artist. You bring up novels and manga and photo shoots. We're historians, Professor Ma. We try to find out what really happened. What benefit did American academics receive? Well, they didn't get canceled. You know, they didn't have to spend 3 years getting death threats. That's a pretty good benefit, I think. People know the game. The people who canceled Mark Ramseyer, and to a small extent myself, they avoided that kind of mob action. That's a pretty good fringe benefit of participating in a canceling. I don't think it's ideological at all. I think it's just human cowardice in the case of American academics. Shaun's point about the idealized model and the non-falsifiability of the model, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that point would come up with any kind of model you try to use to understand history. I think we do try to falsify the model with our extenuating circumstances in the book, but you're exactly right that the model, to a certain extent, it's non-falsifiable. And I think that's what history is for, to try to falsify the model that you used. But it's a very important point. About the Dong-a-ilbo in 1939, I'm sorry, I was being a little flippant in my response. What I was trying to say was that the liberals and the feminists, they're talking about this today, but these women were starving in the 1930s, is what I was trying to say. And there was somebody who came along and offered them a great deal of money to do this very unpleasant thing. And whether that was acceptable morally or not, I have my own strong opinion about it, but it was a way to have something to eat when there was nothing else to eat. As far as the Dong-a-ilbo, I applaud them for what they were writing, and I think it shows that there was freedom of the press in Japanese territory at the time. They were able to, I don't know what iwayuru shiso mondai means in this case. I mean, it sounds like it's more about the ideological framing of what was going on than the actual practice. But if you send me the article, I'd be happy to read it. About trafficking colonial women, Korea was not a colony. I think colonialism is just pure lawlessness. Imperialism is lawlessness. I think the entire point of it is to exploit people of color in other countries. I reject it completely. I think Japan did something very different in Korea. I think that's not what they were doing. About the red baiting, Shaun has proven my point. He is a criminal. He's run a red light. So there you go about the communist. Well, what I'm trying to say, I'm just joking. I don't think Shaun's a criminal. What I'm trying to say about
sign.
a stop sign. Stop sign. I'm sorry, stop sign. What I'm trying to say about the Communist Party is that when the Communist Party is pushing this issue, the Japan Communist Party is different from the Chinese Communist Party. It's different from the North Koreans. I accept that. But when the Japan Communist Party is pushing this issue, it's automatically political. The same thing when the Jiminto is pushing the issue, when some other political organization in Japan is pushing the issue. I'm just trying to get away from that. I think it's very suspicious when a political party is pushing a historical issue. You and I can discuss communism. I actually agree with a lot of what the communists say, for example, about not getting involved in foreign wars and so forth. I'm not opposed to their platform 100%, but I'm trying to step away from the politicization of this issue and try to find out what really happened in the past. And one last thing about Francis's point about the hoax, whether we overstretched the North Korean connection. That's just what happened. That's just the way things are. The hoax was also about Yoshida Seiji, and it was picked up for political purposes by the North Koreans. This has nothing to do with the comfort women history, I want to stress. We're not saying that the comfort women history was a hoax. When we lay it out pretty detailed fashion in the book, we don't in any way think that the comfort women stations or the history or the contracts, we don't think that was a hoax. The hoax started in the 1980s and 1990s. The North Koreans have been pushing it. That's just a fact. Don't shoot the messenger. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Professor Morgan. I think my students are getting tired. Professor Ma, you can have the last word.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to respond to several points. First of all, I'm called sentimental. It's better to be sentimental in this case than to be unsentimental, cold, clinical, talking about these things as business contracts when contracts do not actually exist. I was also ridiculed for using the term rape. How about this term instead? Sex slavery. That perhaps is better than rape, I suppose, in Mark's view. And Mark also ridiculed the fact that I find these comfort women credible, and then he seems to dismiss that. In other words, he finds these comfort women unreliable, incredible stories, distrust them, which I suppose you prove my point. It's a denialist, denying what happened. When you say that I'm sort of finding them credible, you're finding them incredible. It's just the same thing. And in terms of Jason urged me to be a better scholar, to read people other than Kobayashi's graphic book. I'm really sorry, I'm not a historian. I'm a cultural studies scholar. And that's our forte. We study films, we study novels, we study literature and graphic books. And these things actually have a lot to do with the human mind, in case you don't know. And this is supposed to be sort of intellectual dialogue, open intellectual dialogue. I'm not quite sure how many people are coming from my perspective. Why is it so lopsided on one side? Is it really sort of open? And why aren't more people joining in? I was wondering. Joseph?
Oh, thank you for the questions. I think well, we had about 68 people who publicly register. I think people participate for different reasons. We do have a lot of people who do watch the video recording on YouTube. I think one thing is that like this is a sensitive issue, and many people, like, you know, they know like this is recorded on YouTube, and they just don't want their name on, you know, they just don't want their name associated with this issue. I think this is one reason why some people, like, they don't, like, you know, like that some people do not want to, yeah, they don't want to speak on this, they don't want to appear on this. But I'm hoping that, you know, this is important for me and my students, so we do this every year. And I'm very glad that you came, Professor Ma. You offered strong criticism for Professor Ramseyer and Morgan. And I want this to be an open forum where every viewpoints can be discussed. And so I'm hoping, I'm hoping that, you know, Professor Ma will kind of blaze a trail for other viewpoints to appear next year. And so for that, I'm grateful. Okay, and then I just had a couple of quick comments for the speakers. So Professor Ma stressed like we should meet the comfort women directly, and I do agree with that. Initially, I strongly encourage my students to meet the comfort women. So my students every year they went to the house of sharing, and then also when a comfort woman visited my university, you know, we went to hear her talk. But recently, students are still encouraged, but I encourage them a little bit less because one thing I noticed is that like there's been a lot of like, you know, controversy about the politicization of these and about, you know, and so like one of my students, he visited and he told me that like one of the comfort women said like, oh, like, you know, when I was a comfort woman, like the Japanese soldiers killed and boiled one of the women alive and forced them to eat her. And so this was a testimony that one of my students heard. And so I was wondering that, are these like, you know, other women like, you know, are the women allowed to give their testimonies freely, or are they being like kind of pressured in some ways by you know, activists? And so I think that, you know, these days I feel that we should leave these women alone. They should no longer be a public spectacle. And so we should maybe respect their privacy. And so unlike the past, you know, students are welcome to visit them, but this is not something that I push them or encourage. Okay. And then as for what Mark said about I think, you know, Korea is an interesting case because it was a colonial subject. So I think a better analogy for Russia might be like Russia, how the Russian soldiers treated, say, like Ukrainian women, right? And so maybe like a region like Ukraine that is connected, but also a little disconnected. So I think that's the reason why women from Taiwan and Korea is always contested, because part of Japan, but not part of Japan. Okay, so on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. It's almost, you know, it's almost hour and a half, our promised time. Okay, so on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I hope to hear from more of you next time.